I'm going to move on swiftly because I think our next session will dovetail beautifully with what was just spoken there. So I'd like to invite Andy Herscowitz to the stage to talk about drivers of inclusive growth in Africa. He'll be joined by Admassu Tadesse, Tara Nathan, Reeta Roy, and Andrew Herscowitz. Please welcome to the stage. You're back, Reeta. Oh, where's all your guests?
Well, we can speak.
She'll be here soon. Oh, here we go. You would have almost been chatting to me, you know. Yep, round of applause. Yeah, good to see you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Isn't this a great event? Yeah. So this discussion we're about to have is probably the most important one of the day because what's the title of this event? Global Inclusive Growth. And we talk about one of the continents that's been left behind the most. It's Africa. And we look at all the things that are happening in the United States. We heard from Jigger Shaw, who's spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year in the United States to promote green growth in the United States, which is fantastic. The whole world will benefit from the new technologies being developed in the US. We look at the Europeans and others as well, who have their own industrial policies that are going to benefit green growth in their countries as well. But the question that always comes up is, what about Africa? I'm going to share a few statistics. By the end of the century, 19 of the least developed countries in the world will be among the most populous, with a combined population of 2.5 billion people. 12 of the largest cities in the world will be in these least developed countries. We still have probably close to 1 billion people who don't have access to electricity, 3 billion people who still have no access to clean cooking. So we see all of these efforts to promote the green economic growth throughout the US and throughout Europe and elsewhere, but again, the question comes back to, what about Africa? What are the jobs going to be? What's the infrastructure that needs to be built? So we're joined by a wonderful group of panelists. We've got Admassu Tadesse, who is the group president of TDB, who definitely knows the type of work that needs to be done to help promote that growth. We've got Tara Nathan, who is the founder and EVP of Mastercard's Community Pass, and Reeta Roy, who you just heard from as well from Mastercard Foundation. So I'm going to start with Admassu, asking him, what can development finance do to better support Africa's inclusive growth?
Well, thanks, Andrew. Very happy to be here. Great topic. You know, there are a lot of challenges in Africa, of course, and the one thing that you discover when you're in the space there is access is just such a big issue. And it's not just access to credit or access to equity, risk capital. Sometimes it's even access to financial institutions, because when you go into some of the least developed economies, you find that global banks are not even willing to be an institutional bridge to those jurisdictions because of regulations, apart from the poverty and the issues that you have with massive gaps. So access has many faces, and the whole problem now is how can one multiply, intensify, leverage resources into those regions that are so in need of financial capacity. And so for us, you know, we are an investment grade bank. We issue bonds globally. We have to pay global market rates for those bonds that we issue. And so that becomes your cost base. And the question is, how do you intermediate that kind of capital into those regions that, you know, can't afford it, basically? So the question is, how can we do better blending? How can we find different partners that are not going to, you know, require premiums on your risk profile, because those regions...
That's a question. I mean, we hear the cost of capital. We hear this again and again. We heard from Mia Motley earlier today. I had heard her speak earlier this week, and she talked about, you know, in a lot of countries, they're being lent money at 15%, for 15-year money at a variable rate. Everyone knows that they're going to have to renegotiate that at some point. And her point was, why pay lawyers millions of dollars to have to renegotiate these deals when they could have just lowered the interest rates up front? So the question is the global financial architecture as was designed at Bretton Woods 80 years ago, is it working? And instead of just identifying the problem, what are some of the solutions that we can do, that we can provide?
Well, I think there's a number of solutions. I think at the height of the COVID pandemic, we saw magic being done here in DC, where the IMF came up with the SDR initiative. That was a huge game changer. But the sad thing about it, of course, is the vast majority of those SDRs are still sitting in the treasuries of the G7 countries that don't need them. And there's a lot of talk about, reallocating the SDRs, not just giving it to low-rated economies that are not necessarily good for the credit. Even World Bank, even global MDBs that have high ratings can't access some of this money. So I think the global financial architecture discussions is, it's about just finding these blocks and enabling that access even to institutions that are good for it. I don't understand how something as simple as an SDR can't be made available to a AAA.
So for those who don't know, SDRs are special drawing rights, and it's certain allocations that countries own, and there's an argument that money should be made free, be freed up so that it could be used for some of the emerging markets as well.
An example would be IDA. IDA is the concessional window of the World Bank Group. Historically, it was not very easy to access. It was very specifically allocated. But these days, with the innovations in the World Bank Group, institutions like mine are able to access IDA. I wouldn't have dreamt of this 5 or 10 years ago. So I think there is some very interesting development there, but I think there's much bigger pots of money that have yet to open up.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you because both things we're talking about are talking about getting more money. I think we have to also talk about how do we do things differently, because in the political reality of today is there isn't necessarily more money. So everyone's kind of trying to move some things around to find pockets of money that, from an accounting standpoint, that you can free up to make available. But I'm going to move to Tara for just a minute. A key part of changing the infrastructure, and we talk about the need to develop African infrastructure also to drive economic growth, but an important piece of that is the digital infrastructure. And so I guess, to what degree do you see the development of digital infrastructure playing a role in helping promote growth in Africa?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because when we think about, I'll harken back to some of the stats you talked about, right? All the population growth that's going to happen across LDCs, many of which are, on the continent of Africa. What we find is, no matter how you want to cut it, what it amounts to is populations in these LDCs lack access to critical services, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's jobs, whether it's just access to credit, as we talked about. And it's not that these things don't exist. It's not like that there's a shortage of vaccines or that food doesn't exist and that's what's causing food security. Often what we find is that it's a lack of access or an ability to connect supply and demand. And that's what digital infrastructure can really accomplish, right? So when I look at, I run a business called Community Pass at Mastercard, social impact enterprise. It's all about driving driving digital access or digital infrastructure to the last mile. One of the challenges that we find is that a smallholder farmer sitting in a very rural part of Uganda or Ethiopia or across the continent, the two key things that they say they lack access to that would change their lives is they want access to a market where they can sell their goods, and they want access to credit. And this is not credit. I mean, you're talking about big sort of credit deals at the trans-country infrastructure level. These are farmers who want access to a $100 loan.
Right. Who can't afford to pay the 30% interest rate that they're going to eventually get if a big bank lends money to a local bank, which then lends money to their cooperative, which then lends money to them, and now they're...
Well, yes, the rate is one issue, but I'd say even more fundamentally, the bank can't even see who this farmer is.
Right.
Because this farmer exists in a rural, local place. It's often disconnected. 60% lack access to any form of connectivity. 40% lack access to any kind of digital identity. So what does that mean? It means that farmer is invisible. Literally invisible to the bank, so the bank can't even reach them with a 30%, 100% loan. Yeah.
Okay.
And these are the types of things that we see that digital infrastructure is able to give visibility to that end farmer. I have an example of a farmer who I met. I go around and meet all my farmers in the programs that we run. And I had actually a fireside chat with Gloria, who was a bean farmer. And what was very interesting was something as simple as putting her on a digital identity. She was able to authenticate the veracity of the inputs. So instead of buying stones and dirt, she bought real seeds. It's as simple as that. It's not complicated technology and new
It becomes almost like a
whatever.
type of collateral. It's not collateral, but at least people can verify who she is. And
You verify
and-
who she is. You connect her to an authentic input provider. She was able to buy a real seed, and because of that real seed, her output, her offtake increased by triple.
Yeah.
Triple. By then connecting her to one incremental buyer, okay, because she wasn't just held at bay because of the middleman that was going to come to her. She was connected by a digital infrastructure that connected her to multiple buyers. She was able to get 20 to 30% higher prices for her
That's
offtake.
fantastic.
So you can see, and that's one farmer.
Right.
Now multiply it by the millions and millions that we seek to serve.
Okay. So Reeta, I'm going to tell you what I'm most impressed by, okay? And it's going to catch you by surprise. It's the fact that you are based on the African continent. So when we launched Power Africa back in 2013 as a presidential initiative under President Obama, they said to me, we're going to place you on the African continent and get you away from everything else so that you can actually get a sense of what's happening on the ground. I thought was one of the best decisions that they made. So you definitely have a perspective as to what's needed to promote financial inclusion. And I'd love to ask you a little bit about that, what your thinking is about what are the things that we're missing in terms of trying to promote inclusive growth? What unique or innovative approaches do you think that we should be taking?
Thanks so much for your question, and you're absolutely right. It's the best thing is to be based where the action is. So I'd like to talk about solutions. We already know about the high cost of interest rates, the cost of capital when it comes to different institutions, but I want to build on a couple of things Tara talked about. One is, yes, let's absolutely apply digital technology because it brings the cost of distribution down and brings transparency up. But the other is to work with institutions, and these are smaller institutions, financial intermediaries who are closer to community. Because we do need to come up with products which are more affordable, also transparent to the client, so that they understand what the interest rate really is. And we work with a number of solutions, whether it's credit guarantees, whether we're buying down interest rates. But in the long run, that is not sustainable. When the programs end, that ends. What really needs to happen is we also need to restate what is real risk. And for that, you need to look at data. And when we look at repayment rates, non-performing loans, where we just basically look at repayment rates for women, they are on par, if not better, than the general population. And that is data that is widely available. And that's been tracked by CGAP at the World Bank and others. So it's time that we come back and say, why aren't we following the data? And why is the cost of capital 5 times, 10 times, 50 times higher for the very population which can least afford it, but most needs it?
We also saw, there was similar data talking about women-owned businesses or businesses that had majority women on their board tend to outperform other businesses as well. So it's absolutely critical that we do this. Tara, you wanted to say something?
I want to come in on that. I think one thing is the cost, and I think that's a huge challenge. I think the other big challenge that we see over and over again, something we were talking about, I think, before we came out, was the inability to get, where the development banks and where the major funders and donors are funding, which is at the north of $20 million level, down to what's actually needed by a smallholder farmer, which is $100. Let's not say we're getting that low. Let's say we're going up to a micro enterprise that might need a $500,000 loan. Let's go a little bit bigger. Let's say we're going to an input manufacturer who might need a $5 million loan. We are nowhere, we don't have an operational capacity or capability across the development sector, much less before we even get to price, to get that money down.
So there's definitely this gap on ticket size, and I come from development finance world, and I saw how all the development finance institutions, very few of them will do loans less than $10 million. To reach those smaller borrowers, they'll work through local banks or other banks and then do the lending, which makes sense. They don't have the bandwidth to do due diligence on every $200,000 loan that they can do. but the pricing then obviously gets passed on to them. I'm going to turn back to Admassu to talk about this a little bit. Like, how do we get to that point where you're financing those smaller ticket sizes, but it's not at an extremely high interest rate? And often people will say, well, you can't mess with the interest rate because it'll distort the local market. I don't always buy that so much, but I want to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, Andrew, I think the mainstream development finance institutions were set up to move the needle on larger investment flows, and so that's why you end up with this ticket size issue. They are also wholesale, so they're not designed to sort of intermediate at a smaller level. But I think for us, we realized this problem, and we said, well, the problem is structuring. So we just created a new institution within the group, and this new institution does smaller ticket sizes. The KPIs, the positioning of the whole outfit is to do less than $5 million. It can even be less than 1 million. And even though they are not positioned to be sort of very intensive in terms of having large customer sizes, they give a lot of focused love to the aggregators, the microfinance folks, the SME lenders, the cooperatives and so on. And so we've started to address that, but then it's one thing to give access; it's another issue to talk about that cost of access.
Well, and It's not just about money. We've been focused on money, but there's the skills gap as well. And Reeta, I'm hoping you can talk about that a little bit. A whole new green economy is going to come with having to train people and get people to be doing things differently. And so, in your work that you see on the African continent, what can be done to help close that skills gap to make sure that Africa is able to participate fully in this new green economy?
Well, there's a lot that can be done, but there's also a lot that's already underway, and we just need to keep at it. So one of the biggest reasons why the foundation invests so heavily, both in formal education, but also other forms of education, which delivers skills, delivers knowledge, connects people to markets, connects people to networks, mentoring, business development services. And it's all about designing with intention, to understand where do you want this young person, this young entrepreneur, this farmer, this woman trader in the market, where do you want her to land? And designing with intention so that there's a clear throughput in terms of starting point of acquiring knowledge, being able to actually deploy resources and that knowledge, and access markets.
Tara, did you want to address this as well?
Sure. In our work across the continent, I don't know what the number, it's north of 50% across most markets of the working population across Africa is in agriculture. And so if we're looking for employment opportunities for the continent, to me, it has to be in ag. But how do you get higher paying, how do you make agriculture sexy again?
So it's not just
right?
growing,
growing
the products, and then it's exporting them, but how do you add manufacturing and processing?
Or digital jobs, right? So the digitization, to me, of agriculture can sort of start to add value add. It can start to grow single entrepreneurs, single smallholder farmers into entrepreneurs, into larger entrepreneurs. They can build businesses where, they now become, employers themselves.
Can I build on Tara's comment? So absolutely, agriculture by far is the biggest backbone in many countries in terms of the economy. But it's not just primary production, it's everything from logistics, transportation, packaging, retail. And across every single value chain, whether it's cocoa, whether it's a grain, whether it's sesame seed, etc., there are jobs. And it's all about looking at where is the demand coming from, and how do we meet that demand?
So I'm going to come back
across their jobs.
I'm going to come back to infrastructure then. So one of the key issues, and I've pointed this out in the past, is that when you look at how many countries there are in Africa, you've got countries like Ethiopia, which have 100 million people, and then you've got countries that have 2 million people as well. And you can't have the same level of manufacturing growth in every country, but the key is going to be the interconnectivity, both digitally, from a logistics standpoint, but also the raw infrastructure, the roads, the ports. And that's where the investment needs to happen, I would argue, because you need to make sure that those small economies can have some role to play as we grow in the green economy. I'd look at West Africa. If you were to draw a line from Abidjan and Ivory Coast to Lagos, Nigeria, you're going to have probably close to 1 billion people living just in that region, in that area right now, with tremendous resources that are going to come down from the northern countries in the Sahel and the ability to export them globally. Do you have any thoughts, concluding thoughts about how we develop that large infrastructure?
Yeah, I think the closest thing you have to a silver bullet is this infrastructure development, because it helps the small countries, the big countries, the landlocked countries. And what you find often is at the enterprise level, the farm level, they are competitive, but the minute the product leaves the farm, the costs start to mount heavily, and they lose stuff in terms of storage, the logistics is not there, it's very expensive. And so I think, that's the one area I think we just need to keep pushing very hard at the ecosystem level, because I think the inheritance of Africa is infrastructure has always been so underdeveloped. And it becomes a binding constraint to agriculture, to industry, to mining, to value addition. If you don't have affordable energy, there's no way you can do any kind of beneficiation. If you want to go into agribusiness, you need energy, and you need the infrastructure to help move the product back and forth, and it has to be efficient enough for you to be competitive. And so I think we have a long journey ahead of us in terms of infrastructure, and I think it lifts up the small folks as well as the big folks.
So we know what needs to be done. We need to invest in infrastructure. We need to invest in skills development. We need to focus in digital infrastructure as well, and greater coordination and regional trading as well, to make sure that the African continent participates in this new economy. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.